Episode 16, Kings, Czars, and Emperors, an AP European history podcast by Hammer History Productions. Welcome back to the once and future present. Cross-country season is finally over, and I have to admit, it feels strange not heading out to practice after school. I suddenly have free time again, which probably means I should use it to catch up on reading. Last episode, Dr. Morgan and Professor Theo walked us through why France became the most powerful monarchy in Western Europe while Spain declined. Today, we move east. Why did strong monarchies rise in places like Prussia, Austria, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire? And did absolutism look the same in all of them?
It did not. That is one of the most important lessons of this chapter. Absolutism was not a single blueprint. Different rulers centralized power in different ways depending on geography, war, social structure, and local traditions.
And we should remember that no ruler, however grand the title, governed alone. Every monarch depended on nobles, soldiers, tax collectors, church leaders, or local elites. Even so-called absolute power had limits.
So when historians say absolutism, they do not mean unlimited magic powers.
Sadly, no crowns of invisibility today.
Disappointing. Dr. Morgan, where do we start?
A useful starting point is the devastation of the 30 Years' War. Large parts of Central Europe suffered destruction, population loss, famine, and economic disruption. After such chaos, many rulers concluded that stronger central governments were necessary for survival.
Why would war make kings stronger instead of weaker?
Because war rewards states that can organize resources efficiently. Governments needed to collect taxes, recruit soldiers, supply armies, and make quick decisions. A ruler who could centralize authority often had an advantage over fragmented political systems.
Also, many representative bodies in Eastern and Central Europe were weaker than Parliament in England or the Dutch provincial estates. That gave monarchs more room to expand power.
So if your legislature is weak and your neighbors are dangerous, absolutism becomes more likely.
Precisely.
Social structure mattered too. In many eastern regions, large landowning nobles dominated rural peasants through serfdom. Monarchs often made bargains with those nobles rather than confronting them directly.
Meaning kings gained support and nobles kept privileges.
A classic case of negotiated power.
Let's start with Prussia, because later in history, Prussia becomes a very big deal.
That is one of the strange pleasures of studying history. A place that begins as a scattered, vulnerable state can later dominate headlines, maps, and wars.
Correct. Brandenburg Prussia began as a collection of scattered territories ruled by the Hohenzollern dynasty. These lands were not naturally secure. They were separated geographically, lacked strong natural borders, and faced powerful neighbors.
So weakness pushed them toward strength.
Exactly. Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, ruled from 1640 to 1688. He recognized that survival required a standing army and an efficient bureaucracy. He used taxation to fund military expansion and reduce the influence of representative assemblies. He also sought to unify scattered territories through more regular administration, so distant provinces answered to the same dynasty.
That sounds expensive.
It was, which is why political cooperation mattered. Frederick William reached an agreement with the Junkers, the landowning nobility. They supported royal taxation and military policy. In return, they kept social dominance over peasants and gained prestige as army officers.
This is where ordinary life enters the story. Peasants in Prussia often faced harsh labor obligations and limited freedom. The state and noble elite reinforced one another. In much of Eastern Europe, serfdom was tightening at the same time that Western Europe was slowly moving away from it. Landlords wanted grain exports and reliable labor, so peasants could be tied more tightly to estates just as monarchies were becoming stronger.
Did ordinary people benefit at all?
Some gained order and protection from invasion, but many paid through taxes, labor, and required military service.
Frederick William I, ruling in the early 18th century, pushed this system further. He prized efficiency, military drill, and obedience. He sharply reduced court luxury, directed revenue into the army, and expanded the state bureaucracy. Prussia became known for administrative discipline and a powerful army out of proportion to its population.
Later observers joked that while many states possessed an army, in Prussia the army possessed the state. That exaggerates matters, but it captures how deeply military values shaped education, manners, and public life.
Prussia also developed systems for recruitment that connected villages to the army. Men could expect military service to be a normal obligation of life, which further linked local society to the central state.
So Prussia became powerful partly because it felt insecure and organized everything around war.
That is an excellent summary.
How is Austria different? Because right now Prussia sounds compact, disciplined, and military, while Austria sounds older and more complicated already.
The Habsburg monarchy was a composite monarchy, meaning one dynasty ruled many different territories. These included Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and other lands with different languages, laws, and customs.
That sounds hard to govern.
Imagine trying to run several countries at once, each convinced its traditions should come first.
After the 30 Years' War, the Habsburgs tightened control, especially in Bohemia, where Protestant nobles had revolted earlier in the conflict. Rebel lands were confiscated, loyal nobles were rewarded, and Catholicism became an important source of political legitimacy and unity.
Religion again acting as politics.
In early modern Europe, the two were often deeply connected.
Another key factor was the Ottoman threat. Habsburg rulers spent decades fighting the Ottoman Empire along their southeastern frontier. Military pressure encouraged greater centralization because armies had to be funded, supplied, and coordinated across long borders. Victories after the failed Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683 helped the Habsburgs expand influence into Hungary and Transylvania.
So war helped build the Austrian state too.
Yes, but Austrian absolutism had limits. Hungarian nobles resisted full centralization and preserved many traditional privileges. At several moments, they rebelled rather than accept complete royal control, forcing the dynasty to compromise.
Was Austria really absolute if nobles still had privileges?
Important question. Absolutism is often a matter of degree. Habsburg rulers became stronger, but they still had to bargain constantly with regional elites.
Vienna became the political and cultural center of the monarchy, but the empire remained diverse and somewhat decentralized.
That diversity could be a strength. The Habsburgs ruled Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Croats, Italians, and others. Yet each group brought local privileges and expectations. Governing required compromise as much as command.
Russia always seems both connected to Europe and separate from it. Is that fair?
Very fair, and historians have debated that question for centuries.
Russian state-building developed under unique conditions. Earlier Mongol domination influenced taxation, military organization, and centralized authority. The rulers of Muscovy expanded steadily across forests, steppe, and river systems, and by the 17th century, the Romanov dynasty restored order after a troubled period known as the Time of Troubles.
That title alone sounds bad.
It was. Russia faced famine, foreign invasion, and dynastic crisis. Restoring order strengthened the appeal of a powerful czar.
Then comes Peter the Great, and he has one of those names that suggests the textbook already has an opinion.
Yes, Peter ruled from 1682 to 1725 and dramatically expanded Russian power. He traveled in Western Europe, studied shipbuilding and military methods, and returned determined to reform Russia. He built a modern army and navy, fought Sweden in the Great Northern War, and won a major victory at Poltava in 1709.
Why does Poltava matter?
It signaled Russia's arrival as a major Baltic power and weakened Sweden's dominance.
Peter also wanted Russia to look more Western. He pushed nobles to adopt Western clothing, manners, and grooming. Famous example: beard taxes and shaving orders for elites. These reforms were symbolic as well as practical. Peter wanted to signal that old customs would no longer define elite identity if they blocked state power.
Nothing says reform like forced facial hair policy.
Governments have made stranger choices.
Peter founded St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea as a new capital. He wanted a window on the West that connected Russia more directly to European trade and diplomacy. It was built at enormous human cost, using forced labor from peasants.
So modernization came with coercion.
Absolutely. Peter also created the table of ranks, tying noble status to service in the army or bureaucracy. Advancement depended more on state service than old birth alone. In theory, that rewarded merit and loyalty. In practice, it also made nobles more dependent on the Tsar.
But while nobles were westernized, serfdom deepened for peasants. Many Russians experienced heavier burdens, not greater freedom,
Why westernize nobles but tighten serfdom?
because Peter wanted a stronger state, not a democratic society.
Now the Ottomans. Europeans often describe them as the outsider empire, which usually tells us as much about European attitudes as it does about the Ottomans.
Many Europeans did, but that reflected bias as much as reality. The Ottoman Empire was one of the great powers of the early modern world. It stretched across southeastern Europe, Anatolia, the Middle East, and North Africa. It controlled strategic trade routes and major cities, including Constantinople, which the Ottomans transformed into Istanbul as an imperial capital.
It was also multi-ethnic and multi-religious. Governing such diversity required different methods than ruling a smaller kingdom.
Who held power at the top?
The Sultan, supported by court officials, military leaders, and provincial administrators. Elite Janissary troops long played an important role in Ottoman military strength. Originally recruited through the Devshirme system, many Janissaries were trained as loyal servants of the state.
Wait, what exactly was the Devshirme system?
It was a levy in which the Ottoman government took some Christian boys from the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and trained them for military or administrative service.
It could be traumatic for families, but it also offered some recruits education, status, and advancement that would have been impossible in their home villages.
So should we think of that as slavery, or is it something different?
It involved coercion and forced removal, so there are real similarities to slavery. But many recruits entered military or administrative careers, could gain rank, and were not treated as chattel property in the same way as people in the Atlantic slave system.
Historians usually compare them carefully rather than call them identical. Both involved loss of freedom, but they operated in different legal and social systems. Once trained, Janissaries often developed strong loyalty to the Ottoman state and could rise to positions of real influence.
Many Janissaries were trained as loyal servants of the state and became one of the empire's most effective institutions.
And the millet system?
Under the millet system, religious communities such as Orthodox Christians or Jews could govern many of their own internal affairs under their own leaders while remaining loyal subjects of the empire. That mattered especially for many Jewish communities. After Jewish people were expelled from Spain during the Reconquista and the policies of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Ottoman Empire became a place of relative safety compared with persecution and legal restrictions in many parts of Christian Europe.
So more religious flexibility than most Christian states at the time.
In many cases, yes. That does not mean equality in the modern sense, but it does challenge the stereotype that the Ottomans were simply tyrannical despots.
Provincial autonomy also mattered. Some regions enjoyed significant local control as long as taxes were paid and order maintained.
That flexibility helps explain the empire's durability. A ruler trying to impose one language, one church, and one custom everywhere would have faced constant revolt.
Why did Europeans portray them as tyrants?
Rivalry, fear, religious hostility, and political propaganda. Early European writers often used the Ottoman Empire as a negative mirror image. By describing the Sultan as a despot, they could praise their own institutions as freer or more civilized.
Let me see if I have this straight. These were all strong states, but strong in different ways.
Exactly. Prussia relied on army building and cooperation with Junker nobles. Austria relied on dynastic rule, Catholic legitimacy, and frontier warfare. Russia relied on coercive modernization and service to the Tsar. The Ottoman Empire relied on imperial administration over diverse peoples.
So the common thread is centralization, but the mechanism was different in every case.
And none were all-powerful. Every ruler had to negotiate with elites, traditions, geography, or resistance from below. Even silence from ordinary people could be a form of resistance through evasion, migration, desertion, or tax avoidance.
So absolutism means centralized monarchy, but not total control.
Well said.
History is often less absolute than the labels we give it.
That sounds like something I should write down for class. Today we saw that absolutism rose for different reasons in different places. Insecure borders helped militarize Prussia. Diversity and war shaped Austria. Peter the Great transformed Russia from above. The Ottoman Empire ruled through imperial flexibility as much as force. Next episode, we turn west again and ask why constitutional government triumphed in the Dutch Republic and England instead of absolutism. Thanks for listening to The Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.
Stay curious and think.